Welcome to the Lyceum Institute Colloquium Series. These colloquia, comprising a pre-recorded lecture and live question and answer session, invite respected academics and intellectuals to challenge our thinking with their expertise and insights. This lecture, the third in our series, is provided by Francisco Plaza, PhD candidate with the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Professor Plaza is a student of John Hittinger and thinker in the tradition of Jacques Maritain. It is from this tradition that he brings us his lecture today, The Breakdown of Secular Democracy and the Need for a Christian Order.
Hello Lyceum members, my name is Francisco Plaza. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Thomistic Studies in Houston, Texas. My primary research interest is political philosophy and culture, and given all the confusion surrounding the two at the moment in the West, we thought it would be pertinent to address the topic of Christian democracy and Catholic integralism. These are political perspectives that you will not find among the various talking heads in the mainstream, as they don't fall neatly into the typical labels that we're all used to hearing at this point, like liberal or conservative. For the sake of convenience, we could say that these views fall largely under the broad spectrum of what most would consider conservative thinking, but try not to let that distract you. Our topic today will go far beyond just the political divisions of our time. What I would like for you to consider first is our culture as it stands today. I'm referring specifically here to Western culture, that is, European, Latin American, North American, etc. Perhaps you only thought of these before in isolation, but what we're going to talk about today is what is common between them under the banner of Western civilization. If you listen to the American left right now, Western civilization ends up being reduced to what they call whiteness, a point which, interestingly enough, the far-right fringe is eager to grant. This, however, is not what has traditionally defined the West. Let's start with a broad overview. What we know of today as Western culture stemmed from a unity found within European culture that then spread to the New World and beyond through European colonial efforts. The common thread that defined European culture in the past was Christianity. Christian culture itself, however, arose first through the world of the Roman Empire, and, moreover, as a proposed fulfillment of Judaism. Thus, prior to the age of Christendom in the Middle Ages, we have the classical roots of Western culture with Greece, Rome, and Israel. It's important to note that the essence of these cultures lies in their understanding of the world, in their overall philosophy and religion. This isn't a matter of genetics or geography, but of reason. This shouldn't surprise us. As human beings, it is our reason that defines us as a species. It is natural to expect, then, that our civilizations ought to be defined by a rational element rather than a strictly material one. But let's take a step back and define what culture is to begin with. Culture can be meant in two senses. One is normative, the other is material. The normative dimension of culture has to do with a kind of ideal. This sense is used when we say that someone is cultured. The idea being that this person is educated, that he has a refined taste, that he is well versed in the arts, literature, etc. The other sense, the material sense, is used when thinking of different particular things that make up a culture, like language, art, music, mores or manners, etc. While these two senses don't tell us exactly how to define culture in itself, they do clue us into the various elements involved. The normative sense in particular also hints that culture involves some direction toward the good. To be cultured is a positive term. It's something that one would aspire to be. If you want to understand what culture is philosophically, I'd say that the best sources are T.S. Eliot, Christopher Dawson, Pope St. John Paul II, and Jacques Maritain. Out of all of these, I use Maritain the most in my own research. So let's look at how he defined culture. Maritain wrote, quote, "For by culture or civilization is meant the common good, terrestrial or temporal, of the human being. If it is true that culture is the unfolding of life properly human, comprising not only the material development necessary and sufficient to permit us to lead a right life here, but also, and above all, the moral development, the development of speculative activities and of practical activities, artistic and ethical, which deserve to be properly called human development." Now, I want to emphasize in that quote the phrase that culture is the unfolding of life properly human. This definition contains a sense of all the different components we can take into account to define culture. Here, culture is understood as a temporal phenomenon resulting from properly human action, which aims at attaining the good in this life. It encompasses the twofold understanding of culture that we developed prior, namely, the material and normative aspects of culture. By speaking both of what culture is made of, as well as the ideal which culture aspires toward in terms of human development. Taking this a step further, as St. John Paul II did, we can also say that culture is what makes life worth living. It is that which primarily shapes and characterizes human life as human from an existential standpoint. What we mean here is the experience of being human, of living out your own life as a person. St. John Paul II explained this as follows, quote, "Man is human thanks to culture. Man lives a really human life thanks to culture. Human existence is culture also in the sense that man distinguishes himself and differentiates himself through it from everything else that exists in the visible world. Man cannot dispose of culture. Culture is a specific mode of existence and of being of man. Man always lives according to culture which is appropriate to him, and which in its turn creates among men the bond which is peculiar to it, by determining the interhuman and social character of human existence." End quote. Culture cannot exist without the human person and his creativity. The reason why culture exists is to help perfect human life. Culture, however, is a natural part of human life. A life properly human is defined around culture. Man always lives in a certain cultural context, a particular social and historical sky. Moreover, man bonds with other persons within that same culture through this commonality. Finally, let's conclude our definition of culture with this thought by Maritain. Quote, "What determines the unity of a culture is first and above all a common philosophical structure, a certain metaphysical and moral attitude, a common scale of values, in short, a common idea of the universe, of man and of life, of which the social, linguistic, and juridical structures are, so to speak, the embodiment." End quote. This is a point we touched upon earlier with Western culture. And it's easy to see under this consideration how religion enters into the picture, as this is precisely what would confer these values that produce a culture to begin with. Having established this, we can now explore how it is, then, that a culture can be described as good or bad. On its face, this is a contentious claim. After all, in the age of cultural relativism, diversity, tolerance, and pluralism, we are told constantly that all cultures are equally worthy, and that it would be bigoted to suggest that one is better than another. This would make you some kind of a supremacist, we're told. Worse still, if you prefer Western culture to the rest, you would be considered a white supremacist, given the aforementioned reduction of Western culture to whiteness. This would be the ultimate sin of our time. On the contrary, however, I hope that you've come to understand thus far why this reduction of culture to race or ethnicity is simply mistaken. It doesn't make sense. If we think of culture instead as a way of looking at the world, then to say that one is better or worse than another should actually follow naturally. If we're operating under a realist framework, we can say with confidence that not only does the world exist as it does, regardless of our interpretation of it, but that if our interpretation does not correspond to reality, then it's false. Putting it more boldly, we would call it a bad interpretation of the world because it's false. On these grounds, then, we can start to evaluate culture philosophically, that is, examining its ideas such that to judge a particular culture as good or bad is not an indictment of the people who belong to that culture. It is an appraisal of the ideas a culture promotes in the abstract. It's important to make this distinction, just as it is also important to understand that while we as human beings are shaped by our culture, we're not determined by it. Thus, cultures can worsen or improve, and the persons within any particular culture are free to accept that or reject it. Let's try to put this more simply. If we go back to our definition of culture, it follows that a good culture is one which has a true understanding of the good, as well as a true view of the world, whereas a bad culture is the opposite. A bad culture is one in which men are led to vice rather than virtue, or, put more broadly, one which leads men away from what is good rather than helping them attain it. Now, as is the case with most human endeavors, we don't believe there to be a perfectly good or completely evil culture. There are gradations with culture. Some are closer to the good, others are further away. Culture is also neither static, nor does it progress in a linear fashion. A good culture can degrade into a bad one, just as a bad culture can improve over time. It seems easy to imagine the fruits of a good culture. Generally speaking, it should produce true works of beauty in the arts, we should be able to see further developments in the sciences, and it should help to foster truly happy lives. What happens, however, when a culture goes astray? A look at any totalitarian regime of the past century can provide an answer there. As politics is built on top of a cultural foundation. We'll return to the political implications later, though. What I would like for us to consider at the moment instead is the effect a bad culture can have on the individual human person. A good culture is one which elevates man, which achieves the purpose of attaining the actual good, whereas a bad culture does the opposite, missing the mark and bringing man lower. This is what allowed St. John Paul II to distinguish between authentic culture from non-culture, as he argued that a bad culture is no true culture, and that such a false culture would only lead to the dehumanization of man. He wrote, quote, "True culture is humanization, whereas non-culture and false cultures are dehumanizing. In the choice of culture, it is man's destiny that's at stake. Humanization, namely man's development, is carried out in all fields of reality in which man takes his place, in his spirituality and corporeity, in the universe, in human and divine society. Culture does not concern solely the spirit or solely the body, just as it is not limited merely to individuality, or merely to sociality, or only to universality. Reduction ad unum always means dehumanizing culture. Man is spiritualized or materialized, deprived of his social aspects or depersonalized. Culture must cultivate man and every man in the extension of an integral humanism, in which the whole man and all men are helped to advance in the fullness of every human dimension." End quote. To be clear, by reduction ad unum, St. John Paul II is referring specifically to the tendency of reducing culture, and also the human person by extension, to just one of its elements, such as its material elements. We saw this before with the example of reducing culture to a matter of race or ethnicity. Notice that, arguably following Maritain's lead, I would say, St. John Paul II speaks here of the need for what he calls an integral humanism. This is central to Maritain's philosophy of culture, as this concept of dehumanizing culture will be vital to understanding his diagnoses of the modern problem along with his proposed solution of integral humanism. For both Maritain and St. John Paul II, bad or false cultures tend to arise out of a reductionism of human nature, either to spirit, matter, individualism, or collectivism alone. This reductionism amounts to an incomplete picture of man, such that what is lacking here is a properly integral humanism, that is to say, the whole truth about man. So with all of this being said about culture more broadly, let's turn our attention to the progression of Western culture throughout history. After all, the first question that should come up is, where does Western culture fall today? Have we progressed closer to the good, or have we gone further away from it? I don't think that one has to be a philosopher or even a Catholic today to get a sense that we're living in strange times, a time of crisis, specifically a crisis of meaning. Here, traditions are destroyed with nothing of substance to replace them with. We're constantly told in the West by the apparent experts in politics and the academy that history moves forward, that we're progressing toward a better world. And yet, in spite of our medical and technological advances, an increasing number of people today live in despair and confusion. Alternative lifestyles are pursued, all of which, by any objective measure, seem to result in more problems than the traditional ones they replaced. Overall, Western culture today appears to be sprinting from its traditional Catholic roots and toward a kind of moral anarchy that demands tolerance of everything except for Christianity. Pope Benedict XVI referred to this as the dictatorship of relativism, wherein there's no absolute meaning apart from the arbitrary whims of each individual, which take on an absolute character ex nihilo. In this modern world, the burden falls upon each individual to create for themselves the ultimate meaning of it all, as truth is no longer a reality to be discovered. Instead, it's something to be created, to be willed into existence by each individual person. Now let's take a step backward and consider how modernity began. According to Maritain, the Middle Ages was a sacral age, which tended toward a completely theocentric view of the world at the expense of itself. That is, for the medieval spirit, the greatness of God must always be in our focus, and if we're to consider ourselves as human beings, it can only be done in deference to God. Maritain pointed out that over time, the Middle Ages began to dissolve once this humility before God turned to despair. The creature was pushed to consider itself as nothing before God, and to even despise this nothingness to maintain its focus upward to the heavens. Modern culture then began with the advent of Christian humanism, which sought to reverse this tendency, to rescue man from this nothingness. However, humanism was anchored by the Christian elevation of man, understood as being created in the image of God and redeemed by God, who took upon human form himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The progression of humanism in Western culture was largely shaped by what Maritain called the problem of grace and freedom. For the Protestant, grace overrode freedom, such that all human good in the world came solely from the import of divine grace, without which no good could be accomplished. With grace above freedom, the human being could participate in the good only in spite of himself, being made to do so by divine action. On the other hand, for those who exalted freedom above grace, the emphasis turned to human action alone without divine assistance. Faith and reason were separated, with faith being seen as something irrational coming from outside the human order, which could not be justified by anything in this world. It became a matter of will rather than knowledge. And for the first rationalists, their answer was to suggest a kind of blind adherence at best to church teaching, while separating the sciences from revealed knowledge altogether. It's this form of thinking which took hold of modern culture more than anything. And with this, what began as Christian humanism became the anthropocentric, secular humanism that we're familiar with today. That's how the modern project began. Now, Maritain distinguished three moments in the progression of the modern project. He called these the classical, the bourgeois, and the revolutionary. The first of these moments, the classical, occurred in the 16th and 17th century, and is characterized primarily by the separation of faith and reason, whereby the impetus was to rely solely upon the power of human reason in understanding order and creating civilization. At first, this human order was fashioned upon the prior Christian pattern, but this pattern would corrupt gradually with each new generation. Within this moment, human beings recognize their intrinsic goodness as persons created in the image of God, but they lost sight of their ultimate end beyond themselves. Culture became the primary end, and God simply became what some call today the God of the gaps, that is, merely the explanation for the genesis of our personal dignity and natural right. So God is simply that which guarantees our dignity and rights. Over time, man would forget this foundation in God, but retain the idea of dignity and rights through habit, while neglecting their very source to begin with in the same breath. In the second moment of modernity, the bourgeois moment of the 18th and early 19th century, moderns recognized that this separation of faith and reason in civilization amounted also to taking a side against the supernatural order altogether. The deeper problem in this moment was the growing desire for man to lord over nature, bending it to whatever one may will through the means of technology, failing to realize that the true good of culture lies instead in allowing man to perfect himself in conformity to the objective reality of his nature, that is, along the demands of nature itself. Thus, the focus of culture now became purely on the goods of this earth, and of ridding ourselves entirely of supernatural superstition. God existed in this moment only as an idea of idealist metaphysicians such as Hegel, who abandoned any true notion of divine transcendence, speaking instead of God's immanence, or in Hegel's case, God being the culmination of history within the world. Finally, in the third moment, the revolutionary, which would begin in the later part of the 19th century, human beings in a spirit of radical atheism sought to remake themselves and the world, no longer content with nature as the machine of this world. This is the moment in which, metaphorically speaking, God dies, in which matter is all that remains, and where any notion of the transcendent meaning we have is lost. By attempting to rule over nature without taking into consideration its fundamental laws, we are forced to submit entirely to the whim of human will and technology. Socially constructed realities are taken as reality itself, the consequence here being that we gradually become more inhuman as we inevitably distance ourselves from our own true nature. This third and current moment has had drastic political consequences, as the various totalitarian movements were born from this loss of meaning and so-called murder of God. Totalitarianism is an inherently modern phenomenon. With man lying at the center of reality and no God above, it is up to man himself to take God's throne. Man himself, now, must constitute the whole of meaning and truth. Totalitarianism is a byproduct of modernity's third moment, in which a tyrant at the head of government effectively takes the place of God, attempting to redefine order, truth, and goodness in his own image instead. This can be manifested in the hard tyranny of totalitarianism against the person, whereby the person is completely replaced by the collective or the state. On the other hand, it can also be found in secular democracies as they attempt to preserve the freedom of their citizens, but without an ultimate reference to a true common good. In this setting, freedom is reduced purely to license. This makes secular democracy more susceptible to lapsing in the tyranny, in particular the soft tyranny of relativism, which casts aside any sense of real community. Under such regimes, we have seen the rise of secular humanism, which is in effect anti-humanistic. Yet, in spite of these consequences, there does remain hope for the modern age, as the emphasis upon human subjectivity which underlies this entire project was actually a genuine contribution to philosophy. Human subjectivity is an essential part of the human being, and must be explored in order to form a complete picture of the human person in the world. Maritain harnessed this in outlining an integral humanism, where man is considered both metaphysically and existentially, using this in the realm of politics by way of what he called a concrete historical ideal. We'll come back to that later. To sum it up, as secular humanism pushes a mistaken view of the human person, Maritain argued that modern humanism in practice amounts to a kind of inhuman humanism. It is inhuman in two senses. First, in that its understanding of the human person betrays the reality of human nature itself. Second, in that this failure to understand the human person in reality carries with it, as a consequence, an error in moral thinking, as human ethics can only be properly understood when beginning from a foundational understanding of human nature itself. For this reason, modern life is inhuman, as it promotes a view of human life and its meaning that doesn't do justice to the true meaning of human life and personhood. While we've painted a somewhat grim picture of modern culture, Maritain nevertheless always maintained a sense of Christian hope. When Maritain spoke of the modern crisis, he thought of it as a twilight before the dawn. And even as he was facing the tragedies of both world wars, he knew that Christ would reign in the end. Even as he evaluated the downfalls of modernity, he also considered the silver linings. Maritain argued that while the modern tendency to overvalue the subjective dimension of the human person at the expense of his, let's say, metaphysical self was a problem in modernity, Maritain did, nevertheless, consider our new appreciation for human dignity and subjectivity as a positive step forward. Maritain called this the prise de conscience in modernity, which he took to be an act of self-realization. That is, an inward look at ourselves as persons. Put another way, it is an appreciation of personhood itself, emphasizing the unique value of each person's lived experience. While the medievals were aware of this aspect of human nature, they weren't as interested in pausing at that consideration, placing their overall emphasis elsewhere with God. Having given the general history of modern culture, I want to focus now on our own time in the present and speak about how our culture is connected to politics. It has been stated often that politics is downstream from culture. From what we've already discussed, it's easy to see how this could be the case. We can also imagine the inverse to a certain degree. Just as culture influences politics from the ground up, political leaders also have the ability to shift the culture in a top-down kind of fashion to some degree. The link between the two is natural for human beings. It's natural for human beings to engage in culture, as culture is a product of human action in the world. Moreover, politics is also natural to human beings. As Aristotle famously said, man is a political animal. The proof for this is very simple. No individual person is self-sufficient. This is true for adults just as it is more obviously true for children. Human life exists within the context of a culture and of a society. Now, good politics will follow from good culture, just as bad politics will follow from bad culture. Too often now, particular groups are held to blame for all the problems of society. But at best, this points to more of a symptom rather than the true cause. If you're unhappy with the current political state of affairs, keep in mind that this is largely a product of our own culture. To address the cultural problems of our day, then, forces us to examine the issue at root. This is where we can deal with the more essential questions of metaphysics and ethics that serve as the principles underlying political thought. The polarization that we're witnessing now in the West is one of competing principles. It doesn't do us any good to argue about particular policies across the aisle if we don't share a common starting point. However, given the modern tendency to doubt the power of human knowledge, it can become impossible to even argue about these deeper principles if one party embraces complete skepticism or nihilism. In response to this obstacle, many that have given in to the logical conclusions of modernism have embraced power itself above reason. There's a simple explanation for this. If the truth can't be grasped, it's pointless to engage in a rational dialogue. And if this is true, the only thing that's left is force. Against the prevailing modern culture, there has emerged a Catholic counterculture that attempts to address the perceived crisis of modernity. While there's some disagreement in the details, what is common with the overall Catholic response to modernism is a need for a recovery of meaning. It is meant to be a callback to reality, the aim of which is to guide man toward his true fulfillment. There's a split, however, among Catholics, and really all Christians in general, with regard to how this can be accomplished. Some look to a complete rejection of modern culture and a total return to the past as being the solution, while others try to look beyond modernity, maintaining what appears to be genuine progress in the modern world, while steering it away from its mistakes. The first of these beliefs can be found largely with the so-called Catholic integralists and traditionalists, while the second is arguably a more mainstream approach within the Christian world that is represented well by thinkers like Maritain and St. John Paul II, along with many others that we haven't mentioned. I've recently completed a review of a new book entitled Integralism, A Manual of Political Philosophy by Alan Phimister and Thomas Crean. You can find this at realityjournal.org. If you're curious to see my critique of integralism in further detail, I'd suggest giving that a look. For our purposes here, though, I want to give you a brief summary of what the integralist position entails and why I think it falls short. As I stated before, the driving thought behind the integralist movement is that modernity must be left behind completely, and that we have already seen an ideal configuration in practice with the Middle Ages. There are two primary claims here. First, that the modern project is inherently flawed to the point that if any aspect were adopted, it would necessarily lead to political failure. Second, that the medieval order is a completed scheme with regard to the establishment of justice and the common good, meaning that it only stands to be emulated if one wishes to live in a truly just society. We can reply to both of these claims with the same principle that we mentioned earlier. When speaking of human affairs, we'd be mistaken to suppose that something is either perfectly good or perfectly evil. The problem with integralism is that it presupposes necessity where there is contingency. They tend to avoid making definite practical claims, preferring instead to speak of universal principles in the abstract. But some of their practical conclusions follow very clearly. For example, integralists believe that liberal democracy, in the broad sense of the word, so think here of classical liberalism, is a product of modern political thought, and as such will necessarily lead to moral corruption over time, even if it begins in the form of a Christian democracy. That is to say, a democratic state within a Christian culture. So, think of our own country. Think of the United States in the 1800s or the early 20th century. Moreover, the implication behind their argument is that if a political society degrades and dissolves over time, this amounts to an overall failure. Such a position, however, is self-defeating when considered simultaneously with their exaltation of the Middle Ages. After all, the Middle Ages themselves also came to an end. Perhaps they'll say in response that the medieval order was dissolved only in spite of itself, not because of itself. That's fair enough, of course, but if that's the case, then we can say the same for a Christian democracy. The main point here is that history can't be viewed as a linear progression that ends with perfection on earth. Bad societies can get better or worse in the same fashion that good societies can also progress or regress themselves. Moreover, given the imperfect and finite nature of human beings, we can make progress in some aspects while simultaneously regressing in others. Maritain's proposal begins with these principles instead, arguing that we can't engage in political philosophy by entertaining utopian ideals in place of real possibilities. While this doesn't mean that we can't account for static moral principles, what it does mean instead is that our true ideals of justice in the abstract can serve only as a target goal that we know that we can only approach but never hit perfectly. Our true ideals will guide us in practice to better ourselves, but we can never expect finality in this life and in this temporal order. Maritain referred to this as the concrete historical ideal, and it's distinct from the standard utopian ideal by its grounding in reality. This realistic ideal takes into account what's possible in the moment by acknowledging the present circumstances of our time. This is what Maritain called our historical sky. With this being said, the concrete historical ideal cannot be static in a practical sense. It may suggest a different course of action depending on the circumstances. This is said within reason, of course, and it's really no different from the variables considered under the Aristotelian framework of virtue ethics. Here's a simple example in those terms. Temperance is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, and to be temperate with alcohol means that we can enjoy a drink, but within limits. These limits are determined by prudence, and the guiding measure is sobriety. Where the line exactly falls will always vary. For instance, there's a different level of tolerance among people, so 3 drinks can seem to be too little or too much depending on those circumstances. What doesn't change, however, is the broader definition of temperance. It would be absurd to claim that some may exercise the virtue of temperance by purposefully getting drunk. Likewise, if it were too specific, it would be absurd to suggest that everyone, regardless of personal circumstances, is only allowed to have 1 drink to remain temperate. If we come back to politics, we can imagine this playing out in a similar manner with a variety of issues. For example, whether or not your country is homogeneous when it comes to the religion of the people. If it is, then it's not hard to imagine preference being given to that particular religion by the state. If it's not, however, then that same act would likely produce more harm than good, as it would likely alienate those who are outside whatever religion is given individual state preference. Let's conclude now with what we would see as the way forward. While the integralists differ from those like Maritain who try to reconcile modern thought with the Catholic tradition, both agree that Christianity is needed in Western culture to have a truly just political society. Let's consider what Western culture is in and of itself. Dawson wrote that, quote, "It is in Christianity that our arts have developed. It is in Christianity that the laws of Europe have, until recently, been rooted. It is against a background of Christianity that all our thought has significance. An individual European may not believe that the Christian faith is true, and yet what he says and makes and does will all spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning. Only a Christian culture could have produced a Voltaire or a Nietzsche. If Christianity goes, the whole of our culture goes. Then you must start painfully again. And you can't put on a new culture ready-made. You must wait for the grass to grow, to feed the sheep, to give the wool out of which your new coat will be made." Now, at the very least, this explains the current state of disorder in the West, as many in our culture actively try to move away from Christianity altogether. This can't be done, really, without also a substantial change of sorts from our culture to something new entirely. Even for those who aren't Christian, they're still inculcated with Christian values, as vestigial traces of Christianity itself continue to permeate Western culture to this day. For instance, the modern values of universal tolerance, equality, dignity, and intrinsic human rights are all grounded within a Christian framework. The danger is that once removed from that framework, these values can only drift away. This is ultimately the role that religion plays in culture and in politics by extension. Modern proponents of secular liberalism today have left a void where religion once occupied, and in its place have struggled in vain to find a replacement. Their efforts have led them to create a kind of self-justifying political religion. Here, their political platitudes like diversity is our strength are treated as matters of dogma. Unlike traditional religion, however, these new political religions have no grounding in ontology. Their moral claims are not anchored by an underlying moral philosophy that corresponds to something in reality. And this is actually done by design. Instead, these political religions push their pseudo-faith by the force of their will alone, mistaking passion for revelation. Christianity, on the contrary, is intertwined necessarily with metaphysical claims. It claims instead that God, not man, is the creator of value, and from a metaphysical standpoint, this actually makes sense when considering God's nature versus that of man. If the religious claims of Christianity are true, then it becomes easy to see why it would be necessary to maintain for true justice and order. But this, of course, is a much different question. Putting that aside, what can be perceived philosophically is that an authentic religion is needed to occupy its place in culture and politics. This can't be replaced by a man-made faith, as this will necessarily fall short of what order demands. If we're going to do anything in ethics or politics, we have to act only with the conviction that the values that we hold are eternally true. Only God can provide this kind of certainty. If, however, we place our trust with man-made values, we engage only in an act of self-deception that will necessarily fall short every time. The reason why is actually rather simple. We know our own nature as human beings firsthand. We know that we're not eternal, and we know that we will always proceed through life with a degree of uncertainty. With all of that being the case, no man-made values can ever exist side by side with properly religious ones, as if they were one and the same. Because regardless of our religious beliefs, we know at the end of the day that we are not God. Thank you.